England, 1847. The glittering chandeliers of Fairfax House cast their light across the ballroom, and for a moment Amelia Godric could almost convince herself she belonged among the glittering crowd. Music floated through the air, violins weaving a bright tapestry over the hum of voices and laughter. Her pale blue gown shimmered faintly each time she moved, and yet she felt strangely invisible, a figure pressed to the edge of a scene too radiant for her heart's troubled calm. She had learned from childhood how to arrange her expression, how to hold herself as though all were well, but tonight that mask felt fragile, like porcelain too thin to withstand the smallest crack. For months she had ignored the whispers in her mind, the suspicion that something precious was slipping away before it had ever been hers. Edmund Fairfax, her betrothed, was handsome, accomplished, and entirely indifferent to her heart. Their engagement was a bargain struck by families, his name, her father's connections, and Amelia had accepted it with the quiet resignation expected of dutiful daughters. Love was never part of the equation, she reminded herself whenever her chest ached at his distance. Love was for poets, not for women who must secure their families' fortunes. And yet, despite all that, she had still yearned for something more than arrangement, more than politeness. A glance, a word, a single moment of warmth might have been enough. But Edmund's gaze so often strayed elsewhere, and lately it had lingered on Viola Ashworth, Amelia's closest friend since childhood. Viola, with her vivacious laugh and sunlit beauty, had always been the brighter star between them. Where Amelia was reserved, Viola sparkled. Where Amelia carried herself with modest grace, Viola commanded a room by sheer presence. And Amelia, foolishly loyal, had never resented her for it. They had shared secrets beneath the willow trees of their youth, whispered dreams in the candlelight of long winter evenings. Viola had been the sister Amelia never had. That bond, Amelia believed, was unshakable. Until tonight. The ballroom grew warm with bodies pressed together in laughter and dance, but a cold unease wrapped itself around Amelia as she searched the crowd for her fiancé. Edmund had excused himself earlier in the evening, his hand brushing perfunctorily against hers, his eyes already wandering past her shoulder as if summoned elsewhere. Viola, too, had vanished, her absence explained with airy excuses that sounded brittle upon reflection. Lady Harrington, sharp-tongued and shrewd, had approached Amelia not long ago and murmured words that echoed still in her ears. "The way your fiancé looks at Miss Ashworth is not how a gentleman should regard his betrothed's dearest friend." Heat had risen to Amelia's cheeks at the suggestion, but denial had tasted hollow on her lips. She knew. She had known for months, and she had buried the knowing deep, unwilling to betray her own loyalty with suspicion, yet the ivy of doubt had grown quietly within her, twining around her thoughts until she could scarcely breathe without wondering. And tonight, with both Edmund and Viola vanished into shadows, the ivy tightened. She slipped through the throng, smiling politely at acquaintances, though her heart thudded against her ribs. The air seemed stifling. A footman informed her the terrace stood empty. The card-room, too, held no trace of them. Her footsteps carried her down the corridor lined with portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with pity or warning. The library door was ajar, and from within came the low murmur of voices. Amelia paused. Her pulse quickened. She told herself she should turn away, that whatever lay beyond that door could undo her entire world, but her hand lifted, trembling, and pushed it wider. The voices sharpened into words. "We cannot continue like this," Viola whispered, her voice shaken in a way Amelia had never heard before. Fairness has never determined marriages, Edmund replied, his tone dismissive, impatient. Amelia is useful to my ambitions, that is all. The words struck Amelia like glass shattering inside her chest. She clutched the doorframe, breathless, as Viola's reply trembled through the air. But you know I love you, and if you love me— You alone hold my heart, Edmund said. Amelia's vision blurred. She should have turned away, should have fled with what little dignity remained, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her forward. The door creaked open under her touch, and the scene unfolded like a cruel painting. Edmund's hand at Viola's waist, their faces inches apart, betrayal painted clear across both their features. Silence followed, broken only by Viola's startled gasp. "Amelia!" "Don't," Amelia whispered. Her voice was steady, though her body trembled. "Don't insult me with excuses." Edmund straightened, arrogance already hardening his expression. "You're making a scene over nothing." Viola was upset. "I was offering comfort." "Comfort," Amelia repeated, disbelief slicing through the ache in her chest. "I heard everything." A murmur stirred in the hallway beyond, curious ears drawn by raised voices. Amelia's humiliation grew heavier by the second, but pride kept her chin high. 6 months, she demanded, her gaze fixed on Edmund. "How long have you deceived me?" Edmund's mouth tightened, but he answered with cold nonchalance. 6 months. The room tilted. The floor beneath her seemed to shift, but Amelia stood tall, her heart breaking in silence. Viola's tears blurred before her, but the sight brought no comfort. For what was friendship worth, if it could be discarded for stolen kisses in the dark? Without another word, Amelia turned and fled. The corridor blurred into streaks of candlelight as she walked swiftly, ignoring the whispers, the widening eyes. She would not crumble here, not where the ton gathered to feed upon scandal like carrion birds. Pride alone kept her upright until the garden air met her, cool and sharp, slicing through her chest like winter wind. There, among the roses, she allowed herself to falter. Her breath came ragged. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of a stone bench, the weight of loss pressing down until she thought she might sink beneath it. Her fiancé, her friend, both stolen in a single, cruel revelation. She pressed her eyes shut, willing the tears to fall silently, but footsteps sounded behind her, measured and deliberate. A deep voice followed, startling her. "Are you unwell, Miss Godric?" She turned. The Duke of Ashford stood a few paces away, tall and commanding even in the softened lantern light. George Cavendish, elusive, enigmatic, whispered about in every drawing-room, yet rarely seen beyond the periphery. His presence was an unexpected intrusion, yet his gaze held something Amelia had not anticipated: concern, unfeigned and steady. Amelia faltered, quickly dashing away a tear. "Forgive me. I did not realize anyone else was here." "No apology is needed," the Duke said quietly. "These gatherings can be overwhelming." His words, simple though they were, pierced the shell of composure she had tried to build. For the first time that night, Amelia felt the ache of betrayal loosen, just enough for air to fill her lungs again. And in that moment, her story began to turn, though she could not yet see where it might lead. The lanterns along the gravel path drew little circles of light on the garden's darkness, and the scent of cut roses drifted in languid waves, as if the night itself wished to hush and listen. Amelia gathered herself, smoothing a trembling hand over the pale silk at her waist. She did not speak at first. Humiliation had a way of stealing language even from the most disciplined minds. It was the Duke who granted her the luxury of silence, who did not rush to fill the pause with consolations that would only bruise more deeply. "I have found," he said at last, voice low, even, "that the cruelest rooms are those still packed with music. They make one feel absurdly alone." The words, unexpected and unsentimental, slipped past her defences. "You speak as though from experience, Your Grace." "George," he corrected softly, as if offering a small mercy that cost him nothing. "Here, in the dark, I think names may be allowed to breathe." She almost laughed at that, at his curiously precise manner, at the strange tenderness of it. But laughter was too dangerous a door. She kept it locked and lifted her chin. "Then you must allow me to remain Miss Godric, George. I have so little left this evening that is properly mine." Something like approval warmed his gaze. "Miss Godric it is." He inclined his head toward a bench set under a yew whose branches framed the moon. "If you sit, the ground will stop tilting." She sat. The ground complied. The stars steadied. The orchestra inside struck a bright flourish, and conversation rose like surf upon stone. It came to her all at once that the world would continue without pity. Dresses would rustle. Wine would pour. The quadrille would be announced. Her disgrace would have no more power over the waltz than a pebble dropped into the Thames. Ripples, yes, but no slowing of the tide. The thought was almost liberating. "You were in the library long enough to hear what should not have been said," he observed, rather than asked. She pressed her gloved hands together, fingers lacing until the seams bit into her skin. "Long enough to learn that I was never, to either of them, a person. Only a convenience." Her voice refused to falter. That, at least, remained within her dominion. "Conveniences," George said, "often burn when set aflame. Perhaps the night has a taste for justice after all." She looked at him sharply. "Justice. Society will call it a scandal, not a balance restored. By morning, they will say I was too plain to keep a man in love, too dull to keep a friend's regard. They will measure my worth like lace, by fineness and price, and find it wanting." He studied her frankly, as though cataloguing a series of truths that he intended to keep. "I suspect," he said, "they will say precisely what is placed in their mouths." "Placed?" "Stories," he replied. "Those are the hors d'oeuvres of a ball, Miss Godric. If one does not serve one's own, one is served up instead." She should have found the cynicism distasteful. Instead, it tasted strangely like safety. "And what story would you serve?" "A simple one, that I saw you in a crowd, and the crowd dimmed." A warmth rose in her face that was not the bruising heat of shame. "You cannot mean to—" "Your Grace, the room would devour such an announcement. They would make a romance of it in a breath, and then devour the romance next." He did not smile, and yet the air around him felt like the ghost of a smile. "Let them work for their supper," he said. "There is something to be said for giving wolves bones too large to carry." She searched his face for mockery and found none. The Duke of Ashford, who was said to dance only with facts and figures and never with women, stood before her proposing, what? Rescue? No. There was too much respect in his posture for that word. a platform, perhaps, upon which to stand while the tide rushed past. "You know nothing of me," she said a little hoarsely. "Enough," he answered, and the word fell between them like a weighted ribbon. "Enough to know you did not deserve the scene you were given. Enough to know you will hold dignity like a candle, even when someone tries to blow it out." She stared down at her gloved hands. "It is very dark," she confessed, the tiny truth sounding enormous in the garden's hush. "Then let us make a little light." The phrase, quiet, practical, moved something stubborn inside her. She lifted her chin again. "And what price does light ask of me?" "Only performance." He offered his arm. "Walk back at my side. Permit me to request the floor. If you can bear it, stand still while I say aloud what I should more prudently keep to myself." Prudently. The word soothed and irritated in equal measure. People have bled for less than making the ton swallow its tongue. People have lived for more. His gaze held hers. "Miss Godric, you are free to refuse me. If you prefer to depart quietly, I shall see your carriage called and wait as long as you wish. But should you choose to stay, should you wish to stand where you are seen clearly rather than peered at through keyholes, then take my arm." She did not move at once. Memory tried to drag her back. Viola's breathless whisper, Edmund's cool voice, cutting affection into ribbons. And yet those ever-bleeding fragments met a newer image, herself, small but upright, upon the Duke's arm. And for the first time since the library door opened under her hand, the ache drew back like a tide at the turn. "Very well," she said, "let us make a little light." His arm was steady beneath her fingers, the fabric cool, the man beneath unmistakably warm and living. Together they followed the lanterns back toward the glass doors, toward the spill of music and talk. The hush that greeted their entrance was soft rather than sharp. Even stillness could be polite. Faces turned, curiosity, calculation, a few glints of unadulterated pleasure at the scent of spectacle. Somewhere, a fan snapped open like a bird taking fright. They stood for the space of a breath, and then another. Amelia felt the weight of 100 assessments descend upon her. She'd braced for it, and yet the heaviness surprised her. George's hand shifted, hardly anything, only a fraction more pressure at her elbow, but it passed through the armor of her dress as if the silk were smoke. She could not say afterward that the hand was necessary, only that she blessed it. He did not signal the conductor at once. He let the air grow taut and fine. Then, without flourish, he lifted his other hand in a small, decisive gesture. The orchestra fell obediently quiet. The hush deepened into a silence with corners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and the words filled the ballroom without effort, not because he raised his voice, but because he wore it like a well-cut coat. "I must beg your pardon for interrupting what is, by any measure, an excellent evening. I am—" He let the faintest breath of humour brush the next phrase. "Not much in the habit of speeches." A ripple, that small domestic cousin of laughter, moved through the crowd. "Nevertheless," he continued, "customs do not always accommodate necessities. I have had the misfortune tonight of learning that time sometimes plays its cards without consulting us. I will, therefore, be brief." His gaze slid to her for the barest heartbeat. Not a plea, not permission asked, merely communion. "I am honoured by the company of Miss Amelia Godric," he said clearly, "and if she permits, I mean to place that honour beyond the reach of rumour." There was the sound of every breath in the room being caught and held like glassware in a sudden storm. Edmund took one step forward. She felt it more than saw it, and somewhere behind him, Viola's fingers closed white around her fan. Amelia was aware of her mother's hand flying to her throat, of her father's eyebrows leaping and then resolutely settling into a merchant's careful neutrality. But all these were painted figures at the edges of a canvas whose centre was simply this: George's voice, calm as a harbour, making a truth for them to inhabit. "If Miss Godric will receive me tomorrow," he finished, "I shall consider my evening more than well spent." He did not kneel, did not make theatre of what he could make plain. It was that restraint, so precise, so unsentimental, that steadied the room. Applause did not erupt. It unfurled, cautious, then committed, and at last it seemed the ceiling itself might tumble with it. The conductor, in sudden need of something to do with his hands, found it in his baton, and a waltz leapt as if delighted to be of use. George turned to her. "May I?" "You may," she said, though she could not for a few seconds locate her own voice in the flood of blood in her ears. The floor opened gently, the way a good book opens when one has marked the page. He did not pull her close. Propriety mattered more now than closeness. And yet, in the distance, he held like a promise. She felt more attended than she had ever been in Edmund's careful clasp. They moved. The rhythm took their feet, and any person with an eye for such things would have recognized that she was not a great dancer, and that he, inconveniently, was. He compensated without thinking, guiding her without steering her, a conversation carried through the bones. After the first turn about the floor, her body understood what his hands meant and ceased arguing with itself. "Are you very angry with me?" he asked quietly. "Why ever for?" "For having used your name to cauterize a wound. I could have done it more privately." She considered. "You did it cleanly," she said. "Society likes blood. You gave them a bandage." "They will still whisper." "Let them whisper about bandages." The room seemed less hostile with motion surrounding her. Light spun off from crystal as they turned, and the reflection made a crown of the moment that she would later pretend not to remember. "I should thank you," she added. "You needn't." "I should," she persisted, because gratitude, when it was true, deserved to be named. "You could have passed me in the garden and left me to disintegrate among the roses." "I do not leave useful things to ruin," he said. "Useful," she repeated, amused despite the wildness still winging under her ribs. "I did not choose the word for elegance," he said gravely, "only for accuracy. Dignity is useful. Courage is useful. You have both. They tend to find each other, like lost siblings." She studied him while they moved, and she began to see it, the way his reserve was not frost but structure, how he placed words as a mason sets stones, for weight, for span, for bearing. He did not court crowds because he did not need what they offered, and he did not flee them because he was afraid. He simply refused to mistake noise for music. The realization loosened a thread of laughter in her chest. How odd, how improbable, what a scandal that the man with the city's coldest reputation had carried the first warmth she'd felt all evening. The waltz closed itself like a letter with a proper seal. He bowed. She curtsied. The applause this time was narrower, directed, a corridor down which they walked without haste. Close at hand now, Edmund's face had settled into something hard and shiny. It would not bend, and therefore it would break. Viola's eyes were enormous, her regret like a light struggling under a wet glass. Amelia's own mother had arranged her expression into a portrait of delighted astonishment. Her father was already calculating the exchange rates of reputation. "Will they hate you for it?" Amelia asked under her breath as they neared the edge of the floor. "Some will be grateful," he said. "I have been impossible to marry for a decade. It has inconvenienced a great many drawing rooms." "And you are repentant now?" She could not help herself. "Contrite beyond measure," he said solemnly, and the glimmer in his eyes relieved her in ways gratitude could not admit. They were not permitted to retreat entirely, not yet. Congratulation approached with lace at its throat. Lady Harrington led the charge, keen and delighted. She pronounced herself charmed at the prospect of the Ashford line continuing with new blood and good sense, then conveyed half a dozen tidbits of news, favourites quivering in her net for future dispatch across breakfast tables. George bore this with a patience that was almost kindness. Amelia discovered to her surprise that she possessed patience enough to match him. The moment transformed itself from ordeal to exercise. Breath, poise, word, breath, until at last they stood in the lee of a floral arrangement tall enough to hide behind. "Tomorrow," he said then quietly, as if speaking to the flowers. "At 2, if that suits." "It does," she answered, and felt the word lodge in a place wholly separate from fear. "And if it does not, if by morning's light you would prefer a gentler path or a different name, send a note. I shall answer it as though I had never spoken tonight." "You would undo it?" "I cannot undo it," he replied. "But I can absorb it, shift it to my account." "I can be a fool alone if need be." She surprised them both by smiling. "You should allow me a share in the foolishness," she said. "I have already rehearsed for it with considerable success." He bowed again, not because anyone was looking, but because he was made that way. "Then until tomorrow, Miss Godric." "Until tomorrow, George." He left her in the care of the room, and the room, in a strange reversal, began to behave. It did not abandon its habits entirely. There were still the purposeful drifts of people toward the best vantage points, still the little storms of conjecture. But the sight of her standing straight, not hunted, rearranged the current. Even Edmund, who approached once, stopped 2 steps away when she turned her face toward him and allowed him to see that it was not a face which could be bullied. He pivoted in a forced arc and vanished, as though the floor itself had tilted to require it. Her mother captured her arm. Her father pressed a dry kiss to her temple. There were words to answer and hands to accept, and a dizzying quantity of tonic to sip from a single glass that never seemed to empty. Through it all, Amelia found that the night moved past her like a page being turned, not by her, not yet, but toward her, and that was a beginning. When at last she climbed into the carriage with her parents, and the door was shut, and the city receded in repeating shadows, her mother's composure dissolved into tears of the purest, most operatic joy. Her father, less lyrical, cleared his throat 3 times and blurted a blessing of such practical elegance that it made Amelia love him for the exact man he was. She leaned her head to the cool glass and watched Mayfair glide by as if it were a painting being rolled up carefully for storage. The night's sequence replayed itself in images: the sliver of light beneath the library door, Viola's hand at her bodice, trying to tie a knot in something that would not hold. Edmund's mouth forming sentences that had no space for her, the first syllable of the Duke's voice in the garden, the sensation of the room going quiet as a field of wheat when wind passes over, the peculiar relief of a waltz that did not try to be a dream. When she undressed, much later, the lady's maid's hands were swift, silent, expertly invisible. Alone, Amelia stood before her mirror and regarded the woman inside it. She expected to find a stranger or some creature made of salt and stubbornness. Instead, she recognized herself, only steadier at the corners, as if her outline had been traced again, this time with a heavier ink. The night carried its own aches into sleep, as such nights will. She woke once to a rattle of carriage wheels ghosting down the street, and thought it must be Edmund riding Pride to ruin. She woke again to her own name in a dream, spoken as if by a man rehearsing a prayer he had not known he could say. She could not tell which waking felt more real. Morning brought the ordinary world with its polite insistence. Coffee steamed. The newspaper arrived already certain of what it would say. Notes came, and when opened, released the perfume of other people's fascination. Her mother arranged flowers with the air of a field marshal. Her father took a meeting in the small room he called his counting house, and emerged twice with the expression of someone who has acquired and survived information. At 1:30, Rose smoothed a dove-grey gown over Amelia's shoulders and declared her perfect with the authority of a coronation. "There," the girl said softly. "You look like someone who decides things." "Do I?" Amelia asked, and Rose, kind, quick-eyed Rose, said only, "Yes." At 2 precisely, the bell pealed. The butler's tread, reverent by training and by temperament, crossed the hall. The drawing-room doors opened, and George Cavendish entered with the exact degree of formality the hour required, no more, no less. He bowed to her parents, to her, and to something private between the two of them that had not existed yesterday and yet seemed to have waited all her life. "Miss Godric," he said. "Your Grace," she returned, and the corners of both their mouths, traitorous and dear, confessed themselves. They sat, her parents relinquishing the room with the graceful reluctance of guardians who understand that the next breath belongs to someone else. The garden lay visible through long windows, the same garden where the night had split and rent it, and the sight of it steadied Amelia as a hand at her elbow had steadied her before. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "That would be very inconvenient," she replied. "I have already forgiven you for the thing you have not yet named." He inclined his head, accepting the reprieve while refusing to dishonor it. "I placed you squarely in a storm." "You put a roof over my head while the storm passed," she said. "I was already wet through." His gaze held hers. "Shall we give the weather a clearer forecast, then?" It was a curious phrase, slyer than his usual. She felt a calmness rise in her, as if a decision had been made in her absence, and returned to her like a letter she had written months ago and forgotten. Every other woman of her acquaintance would have stretched the next hour into ceremony. Amelia chose to treat it as breath. "Yes," she said, more softly than she had meant to. "Let's." The afternoon sun painted the drawing-room with a soft glow, turning the lace curtains to sheets of gold and scattering patterns across the floor. Amelia stood near the window, her hands clasped too tightly before her, watching the street beyond with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The butler's announcement had come moments ago, and now she could hear the approaching rhythm of boots upon stone. George Cavendish entered, not like a rescuer striding into a tale, but like a man accustomed to inhabiting any room without needing to conquer it. His bow to her parents was impeccably correct. His greeting to her was measured, almost formal. And yet, when his eyes met hers, Amelia felt a current ripple through the quiet air. Recognition, acknowledgement, something steadier than courtesy. They spoke first of trivial matters, the roses blooming unusually early, the number of callers that morning, the latest concert rumoured to rival even Lady Harrington's soirees. But beneath every exchange, Amelia heard the hum of what had not yet been said. Finally, when her father excused himself under the pretence of correspondence, and her mother found reason to examine the embroidery on a chair cushion, George turned to her. "I trust you have not suffered too greatly from the events of last evening," he said. Amelia drew a breath. "I have suffered precisely as one does when stripped bare in a crowded room. One does not die of it, but neither does one forget." His expression softened, though his voice remained calm. "Then perhaps memory can be softened, if not erased. That is why I proposed what I did. A story stronger than the one they would have made of you." "A story?" she repeated, almost bitterly. "And we are to be its actors?" He inclined his head. "If you consent. But understand me, Miss Godric. I will not demand. Last night I offered you the chance to choose the narrative rather than be consumed by it. That offer remains." She hesitated, staring at the patterns of light on the carpet. The temptation was clear. With his name beside hers, society's tongue would turn from pity to speculation, from contempt to admiration. But what then? A sham was still a sham, and she had only just escaped one false arrangement. Could she willingly enter another? George must have read the turmoil on her face, for he said, "It need not last forever. A fortnight, perhaps a month. Long enough to bury Fairfax's betrayal beneath fresher gossip. When it ends, we may part ways as amicably as we began, your dignity intact, my solitude preserved." Her heart ached at the cold efficiency of his words, though she knew they were meant to reassure. "And you, Your Grace? What do you gain?" The corner of his mouth curved faintly. "Respite. From the endless parade of ambitious mothers and calculating daughters. A woman at my side, one known for composure under trial, will silence many doors before they open." The honesty startled her, then, oddly, comforted her. No false declarations, no honeyed lies, only pragmatism, spoken plainly. Perhaps that was safer than promises that rotted with time. "Very well," she said at last, her voice steady. "If we are to perform, let us perform well." And so the arrangement began. At the Harrington musical the following evening, Amelia stepped into the crowd upon George's arm. Conversation faltered like a flame caught in draught, and for a heartbeat she feared her knees might give way beneath the collective stare. But George's hand was firm against hers, and when Lady Harrington descended upon them with predatory delight, Amelia discovered her own voice answering with grace she had not known she possessed. Each event thereafter became a stage, each glance a line of dialogue in their unfolding play. George knew precisely when to rest his hand lightly at her back, when to incline his head as though her words carried weight beyond measure, when to step between her and Edmund's darkened gaze without seeming to do so. For her part, Amelia learned the art of leaning into his presence without surrendering to it, of smiling at precisely the moment the crowd's attention sharpened, of letting her voice carry warmth that suggested affection even where uncertainty lingered. And yet, with each passing day, the line between pretended warmth and genuine comfort blurred. She found herself anticipating the sound of his knock, the measured cadence of his speech, the rare but striking curve of his smile when her wit met his. She caught herself recalling phrases he had spoken, not because they served their performance, but because they lingered in her mind like embers refusing to die. One afternoon in the garden, he asked her what she truly desired from life, and she spoke of travel, of knowledge, of a world larger than ballrooms and contracts. Instead of dismissing her dreams as fanciful, he listened as though she were describing treasures he might one day place in her hands. That listening undid her more thoroughly than any declaration of love could have, but their charade carried dangers as well. Edmund's pride, once wounded, did not bleed quietly. Rumours spread of inquiries he was making into George's business dealings, whispers of secrets he might use as weapons. Viola, too, hovered at the edge of Amelia's vision, pale and contrite, seeking moments to speak, to explain, to beg forgiveness. Each encounter left Amelia raw, torn between rage and the memory of a friendship she had once cherished more dearly than jewels. The nights grew heavier with expectation. Invitations arrived daily, each more insistent than the last, for society could not resist the spectacle of a duke ensnared at last. Amelia's mother brimmed with delight. Her father measured dowries and settlements with a merchant's eye. And through it all, Amelia moved as though upon a tightrope, balancing truth against performance, desire against caution, heart against memory. Then came the evening when George's carriage bore her to the Pembroke ball, and a diamond ring, his grandmother's, he told her, gleamed upon her finger. The play had shifted into something more binding, more perilous. For though the world believed their engagement a dazzling triumph, Amelia's heart whispered that the line between arrangement and affection had already been crossed, and that to retreat now would wound more deeply than any betrayal she had ever known. The chandeliers of Pembroke House glittered like constellations lowered from the heavens, each crystal reflecting 100 eager gazes. Amelia entered at George's side, her fingers resting lightly on his arm, the diamond ring flashing fire with every step. The ripple of whispers was instantaneous, a tide sweeping across the room faster than the orchestra could adjust its tempo. Some faces brightened with delight, others sharpened with envy, still others contorted with disbelief. And beyond them all, Edmund's expression, shadowed and storm-like, burned into her awareness like a brand. George bent slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Remember," he murmured, "confidence is half of truth." She lifted her chin, matching his calm with a composure she scarcely felt. The floor opened as if acknowledging them, and Lady Pembroke greeted them with exaggerated warmth, her sharp eyes already alight with triumph at being the hostess of the season's greatest revelation. Amelia curtsied with perfect grace, and George announced their engagement with a calm finality that transformed rumour into fact. The applause was thunderous, Edmund's fists clenched at his sides. Viola, pale and fragile, looked as though she might crumble into dust where she stood. The evening became a blur of felicitations. Hand after hand reached for hers, lips brushed her knuckles, Voices clamoured with congratulations, as though eager to attach themselves to the blaze of their sudden union. Amelia smiled, responded, endured. But beneath the veneer of celebration, tension coiled tighter with each passing moment. She felt Edmund's gaze following her, cold and furious, and sensed that his silence was not surrender, but the prelude to something darker. Later, as the orchestra struck up a waltz, George claimed her for the first dance. They moved with practiced grace, his hand steady at her back, his steps guiding hers with ease. "He is unravelling," George murmured, tilting his head barely enough to indicate Edmund across the floor. "A man who believes the world owes him victory does not accept defeat gracefully." Amelia's heart quickened, not from fear, but from the nearness of George's voice, the certainty in his tone. "What will he do?" "Whatever desperation dictates," George replied. His grey eyes found hers, stormlight and steel mingled. "But he underestimates us if he believes we are unprepared." She longed to ask what he meant by us, but the music demanded her attention, carrying them in sweeping turns across the polished floor. And though society looked on, measuring every step, Amelia felt an odd sense of safety, an assurance that no matter how dark Edmund's schemes, she would not face them alone. The weeks that followed deepened both their performance and the peril surrounding it. Edmund's inquiries grew bolder. Whispers reached Amelia's ears of questions asked in gentlemen's clubs, of papers examined too closely, of merchants pressed for secrets. Viola, in a moment of fragile courage, confessed that Edmund had used her not only as a distraction but as leverage, holding her reputation hostage to ensure her silence. The revelation twisted the knife of betrayal, but also stirred a reluctant sympathy. Viola wept when she spoke, her eyes hollow, her voice shaking as she warned Amelia that Edmund's pride would not rest until he had struck back. George listened gravely when Amelia repeated Viola's words. "Fairfax believes reputation is a weapon," he said. "He forgets that it is also tinder. Strike it wrongly, and the fire consumes the hand that lit it." Yet even as the threat of scandal loomed, their pretense began to feel less like artifice and more like truth. George no longer spoke of their arrangement as though it were a contract. Instead, he listened to her thoughts with a focus that unnerved and warmed her in equal measure. He asked about her childhood dreams, about the books she cherished, about the places she longed to see. When she spoke of Constantinople and India, his lips curved in something almost like wonder. "Then we shall see them," he said simply, as though such journeys were as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Amelia found herself treasuring these conversations more than the glittering display of their public appearances. In the quiet garden behind her father's townhouse, or in the shadowed corner of a crowded salon, they built a language of glances and half-smiles, of truths offered in pieces small enough to fit between propriety's bars. She began to realize, with both dread and joy, that the line she had sworn to guard, the line between performance and reality, had already been crossed. The first time George touched her hand, not as part of a performance, but as a simple, unthinking gesture, she felt the truth surge through her like flame. They were no longer pretending. Or if they were, the charade had outgrown its script, but danger lurked as close as desire. One evening, after escorting her home from a dinner where Edmund's glower had darkened every corner of the room, George spoke with an intensity that sent shivers through her. "He will strike soon. I can feel it. And when he does, We must stand together, Amelia, not as partners in pretense, but as something stronger." Her breath caught at the sound of her name on his lips, spoken not as formality, but as intimacy. "Together," she whispered, though her heart pounded with the enormity of what that meant. Days later, his carriage bore her once more into the lion's den of society. Whispers sharpened to open speculation. When would the wedding be? Was the Duke truly besotted? Could plain Amelia Godric possibly hold the interest of England's most elusive bachelor? Every question was a test, every glance a blade. And yet, each time George's hand closed around hers, each time his steady voice affirmed their union, she felt less like prey and more like a woman stepping into her rightful place. It was at another glittering ball, beneath another constellation of chandeliers, that the truth broke through her fear entirely. They danced again, the world watching, and George's eyes held hers with a fire that made every rumour irrelevant. "This began as a shield," he said softly, his lips close enough that only she could hear. "But it has become something I can no longer pretend away. Amelia, I find I want not the play, but the life." Her reply trembled, but did not falter. "Then let us have it." The music swelled, the crowd looked on, and the dangerous arrangement, born of scandal and necessity, transformed before their eyes into something far more perilous and far more precious, the beginning of love. The morning of the Pembroke ball dawned bright and unsparing, as if the sky itself intended to bear witness to the reckoning long overdue. Amelia stood at her window in the Godric townhouse, the dove-grey silk of her gown catching the early light. Her reflection in the glass seemed almost unfamiliar. A woman steadier than the girl who had once toyed with lace trim to disguise trembling hands. In her heart beat both dread and determination. Tonight, Edmund would be forced to face the ruin of his schemes. Tonight, the dangerous arrangement she had entered with George would either shatter or crystallize into truth. The hours passed in a blur of preparation. Rose, her maid, fastened diamonds at her ears with reverent fingers, whispering that London had never spoken of anything but the Duke and his chosen bride-to-be. Her mother wept openly, equal parts joy and disbelief. Her father muttered about settlements and dowries, his merchant's mind clinging to numbers even as pride softened his stern features. And Amelia listened to the rush of her own pulse, whispering silent prayers that dignity would not abandon her when she needed it most. By evening, the carriage door opened before Pembroke House, and George offered his hand. The diamond ring gleamed, catching lamplight and envy alike. Together they ascended the steps, the air buzzing with whispers even before the butler's voice announced them. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, and Miss Amelia Godric. The words rippled through the crowd, carrying astonishment, delight, bitterness. And there, by the far wall, his glass of champagne trembling with restrained fury, stood Edmund, Viola beside him, pale and ghostlike. Lady Pembroke greeted them with florid enthusiasm, her eyes devouring the ring on Amelia's finger. George, calm as ever, confirmed their engagement with a voice that silenced the room. Applause erupted, perfunctory and breathless, while Edmund's expression collapsed into thunder. Viola lowered her gaze, unable to withstand Amelia's steady look. The evening unfolded with the formality of ritual. Well-wishers clustered, congratulations piled upon congratulations, and Amelia bore them all with poise. Yet beneath the surface ran currents of tension sharp enough to draw blood. George's hand at her back steadied her, but each glance toward Edmund promised confrontation, and it came. In the midst of a waltz, as George guided her with practiced grace, Edmund strode across the floor, cutting through the dancers, his voice low but venomous. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his eyes fixed on Amelia. "But this is a charade, and charades collapse." George shifted, his body a shield, his tone deceptively mild. "Former fiancés should know when to bow gracefully. You have already lost." Edmund's face twisted. "You don't know what I know." "The Duke is not the untouchable paragon you believe." His voice rose, drawing curious glances. "I will see you both ruined." But before he could finish, George raised his voice, calm yet commanding enough to halt the music. "On the contrary, Fairfax, tonight ends your games." He turned to Lord Harrington, who stepped forward as if on cue, a folder of documents in hand. "Your pattern of deceit is no longer rumour. It is proof." The crowd pressed closer, breath held in collective anticipation. Lord Harrington's voice rang clear as he detailed Edmund's calculated betrayals, engagements made for business advantage, settlements extorted, reputations left in tatters. Murmurs swelled into gasps. Faces turned cold. Viola buried her face in her hands. Edmund staggered, rage and fear warring across his features. "Lies," he spat. "All lies." George's gaze was unflinching. "If they are lies, then answer them in court." "But we both know you will not, for truth would devour you faster than scandal." Silence fell, sharp and merciless. At last Lord Fairfax himself spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "Edmund, you have brought shame upon us all. This engagement is dissolved, and our ties with the Godric's severed. Leave at once." Edmund's protest died in his throat as he saw the truth in his father's eyes. He cast one last venomous look at Amelia before turning on his heel and storming from the room, Viola trailing after him, her tears leaving a path of sorrow in her wake. The orchestra, uncertain, hesitated until George signalled. Music returned, tentative at first, then swelling as though eager to erase what had just transpired. George turned to Amelia, his hand closing around hers. "Courage," he murmured. "You have won more than dignity tonight." But Amelia's eyes filled, not with triumph, but with release. "I have lost too. A friend, once dearer than a sister." George's expression softened. "Some losses carve room for what is truer. And tonight, Amelia, I ask not as a shield, not as a pretense, but as a man stripped of his solitude. Will you be mine, not for performance, but for life?" The room hushed again, but this time it was not scandal that commanded silence. It was hope. Amelia's heart swelled, and for once she did not fear its betrayal. "Yes," she said simply, and the word rang truer than any vow she had ever imagined. The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, astonishment. But Amelia heard none of it. She heard only George's voice as he bent close, his lips brushing her ear. "Then let us begin, not in arrangement, but in love." Weeks later, beneath the vaulted arches of St. George's, Hanover Square, Amelia walked toward him in ivory silk, her father's arm steady at her side. The church overflowed with London's elite, but she saw only George, his grey eyes lit with devotion, his entire countenance transformed by joy. Their vows bound them not in duty, but in choice. And when his lips touched hers at the altar, the world itself seemed to exhale in benediction. Their marriage blossomed not as society expected, but as they chose. At Ashford Manor, Amelia remade the Duchess's role into one of warmth and intellect, hosting gatherings where music and philosophy replaced empty gossip. George, once thought aloof, revealed his humour, his tenderness, his quiet hunger for companionship. They quarrelled, they laughed, they dreamed together of journeys across oceans, and through it all, Amelia felt the wound of betrayal heal, replaced by the steady pulse of a love she had never dared believe in. One autumn afternoon, seated with George in the garden where roses spilled over the stone walls, Amelia reflected on the path that had brought her here. Betrayal had nearly broken her, but it had also freed her. Scandal had threatened to define her, but she had chosen her own story instead. And beside her sat a man who had once been a shield and had become a partner, a confidant, a love truer than she had ever imagined. George reached for her hand, his thumb brushing lightly against her ring. "Strange, is it not?" he mused, "how the cruelest beginnings can yield the gentlest endings?" Amelia smiled, her heart full. "Not endings, George. Beginnings, always beginnings." The late sun bathed them in gold, and as they leaned close, their lips met with the promise of all the tomorrows still to come. And so, from the ashes of betrayal and the shadows of scandal, Amelia Godric and George Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, forged a life together. Not an arrangement, not a performance, but a love born of honesty, tempered by courage, and destined to last beyond the fleeting whispers of society